The Travels and Adventures of Little Baron Trump and His Wonderful Dog, Bulger. Chapter 5, Part 9. So sure was I that death was about to strike me that I wrote out several messages to the elder baron and to the gentle baroness, my mother, on the leaves of my notebook, and left directions with one of the chief's serving men that, in case of my death, it was my wish that he should send them to my people, whom he would find on my ship in the beautiful bay on the distant shore of the island. I said nothing about Bulger, for I knew only too well that he would die by my side. I prepared for the worst. I examined the primings of my pocket pistols and concealed my dagger under my coat at the back of my neck, where I would be better able to reach it if it came to close quarters. This done, I proceeded to cut my fingernails to as sharp points as I could, for I was determined to sell my life as dearly as possible. While I felt confident of Chief Zwish Swish's affection for me, yet I couldn't tell at what moment he might lose courage and turn me over to the mob in order to save himself. Bulger watched all my preparations with wide-opened and intelligent eyes, occasionally giving utterance to a low, nervous whine as the howling, shrieking, roaring mob surged back and forth in front of Chief Zwitch's dwelling. By the law of the land, the common people were prohibited from entering the inner enclosure of the chief's abode, but Gowiz, being one of the nobles or minor chiefs, was entitled to advance into the chief's presence and state his wrongs or make his requests. So now the raging Gowiz, parting from his followers, who never ceased crying out for vengeance upon the little demon lump, who, on two different occasions, had spread death and destruction among their people, strode into the presence of Chief Zwitchwitch. The chief was calm. He had not partaken of any food for 24 hours, and stood up, wrinkled, creased, and seamed, as the wind-eaters always look when fasting. Near him sat Queen Fuyu and Princess Pufaw, while directly behind him were ranged his three counselors, Hissa, Wurwur, and Shaboom. They were well-rounded, only by recent draughts of strong and wholesome west winds, and hence looked as contented and smiling as Swish Swish looked sad and solemn. I stood in an adjoining apartment, concealed behind a bamboo screen, with my faithful Bulger by my side. I was so placed that I could see all without being seen myself. Chief Zwitchwish knew of my presence there. As Bulger caught a glimpse of the raging and bellowing Gowiz, he grew so nervous that I was obliged to stoop and stroke his head to let him know I feared nothing. But the fact of the matter is, great dangers always exert a subduing influence upon me. I face them coolly, but sadly, for my thoughts in such moments go back to the elder baron and to the gentle baroness, my mother, in the faraway home neath the skies of the beloved fatherland. Like a huge football impelled by the kick of some gigantic foot, Gowiz landed in the audience chamber of Chief Zwitchwitch. He shook his arms violently and bounded up and down with inward fury, for he was still too much beside himself with rage to utter any other sound than a deep rumbling growl or mutter. From my place behind the bamboo screen I followed, with all the keenness of sight for which I am so justly famous, every movement of the furious Gowiz, as well as the actions and demeanor of Chief Zwitchwish and his counselors, for I was determined not to be caught napping in case any signs of treachery should be visible. At the very first glance, I saw that the rebellious Gowiz had something hidden in his girdle, and from the shape and length, I knew at once it was a flint knife. Quick as thought, I beckoned a serving man to my side and sent a message to the chief, telling the attendant to appear to be engaged in waving the branches of perfumed leaves, as was his duty, while he whispered in the chief's ear. It was as follows: "Be on thy guard, O chief. The brawler hath a flint knife hidden in his girdle. He will attempt to slay thee. Be careful. Be calm. Gowiz had now quieted down a little, but with a voice of thunder he began his tirade. He pictured the long years of peace and happiness on their island, the blessings they had enjoyed under the long and glorious line of rulers of which Zwitchwitch was the worthy descendant. He thundered out defiance against all the enemies of the Wind Eaters, and, as softly as possible, roared his own praises, telling of the many deeds of valor he had performed in Zwitchwitch's service, and ended by declaring himself ready and willing to die for his beloved chief. When Gowiz had spoken, the chief bowed his head for a few moments in silence, and then made answer. Thou hast spoken truly and wisely, O Gowiz. Thou art brave. Thou hast the right to demand favor at my hands. Speak, Gowiz. What may Zwitchwish do for thee? At these words of Zwitchwish, all the former fury of Gowiz broke forth once more. Pounding his chest and striding up and down the audience chamber, he roared out, That thou givest into my hands this very hour the solid demon, the dreaded man-lump, the monster thick all through, who hath brought all this death and ruin into our peaceful land. Chief Zwitchwish was silent for a few moments. Need I tell you that my very heart listened for the reply? I could hear nothing but the deep, coarse, grating sound of Gowiz's breath as I leaned forward to catch the first words which should fall from the chief's lips. It seemed a lifetime. At length, Zwitchwitch spoke. My brother, thou art inflamed with the deep draughts of the fierce and raging north wind. Thou art beside thyself. Thou seest not clearly. I must not adjudge death except when the decree will rest on the laws of our fathers. True, the little man, thick all through, hath been the cause of great misfortune to our people, but the innocent cause. He hath not striven or desired to harm us. He is a lover of peace, a friend of his kind. My followers were warned of the danger of the crimson tongues. The man-lump did not seek their death. And full well, too, thou knowest that the laws of our fathers bid us to hold the lives of our guests as sacred as the texture of our skin. Go thy way, therefore, Gowiz. I cannot doom the man-lump to death. Is this, roared the disappointed leader, the kind of justice which thou givest to my people? Aye, it is, thou brawler, replied Chief Zwitchwish, now fast loosening control over himself. Hold thy peace and depart, lest in my wrath at thy frequent wrongdoing I give thee over to merited punishment. Have a care, Zwitchwish, roared Gowiz, boiling over with rage. Have a care lest thy people rise in their might and cast thee out, thou unjust ruler. Begone, I say, was Zwitchwish's calm but stern reply. Go thou first, then, traitor to thy people, thundered out Gowiz, springing forward with the flint knife raised high in the air. Cries of terror burst from those gathered in the audience chamber, but Chief Zwitchwish calmly put forth his hand and touched the would-be assassin. With a deafening crack, the body of the raging Gowiz flew into 1,000 pieces, like a huge balloon seized by the hands of the tempest and whirled against the spear like branches of some shattered oaken monarch of the plain. Queen Fuyu and Princess Pufaw, bewildered and terror-stricken, clung to each other, while silent fear sat on the faces of those around the chief. But he was calm and spoke a few words in a mild and steady voice to the queen and the princess. When the people learned of Gowiz's attempt to slay their ruler and how the brawler, at the very instant he lifted the flint knife to strike, had been mysteriously stricken dead at Zwitchwish's feet, they sent out loud huzzas, for the fierce Gowiz was more feared than loved even by his followers. It required several days for the village of the Wind Eaters to quiet down and take on its everyday look after the mysterious death of Gowiz. But with his disappearance vanished all opposition to Chief Zwitchwish's rule. The people firmly believed it was the avenging spirits of the air who had touched the Brawler with their sword points when he raised his hand against their ruler. I need hardly tell you that the chief's gratitude to me knew no bounds. No gifts were too beautiful or too costly to be offered me, and the fact that I declined them only seemed to strengthen his affection for me. But how dared I reject the gift of the hand of the fair Princess Pufa? To do this would be to undo all that I have done, to make Zwitschwisch my enemy, to transform his love into hate, his confidence into suspicion, possibly to write my own death warrant. There was but one course left for me to pursue, and that was escape. And escape, too, it must be at once, before I had lost the chief's confidence. One of Zwitschwisch's first acts, after his rescue from the flint knife of the murderous Gowes, was to restore me the tiny instrument with the invisible point. This done, a terrible load seemed to be lifted from his mind. He became himself again, and with his returning happiness and content came a still stronger desire to hasten my marriage with the Princess Pufa. With the greatest caution, I made this and that excuse in order to gain time to collect my thoughts and settle upon some plan of escape, for recapture I knew meant death, or worse than death, imprisonment until I should consent to give up all desire to leave the island of the Wind Eaters and pledge myself to become, so far as nature would permit, one of their people. Cautious as I was, my excuses awakened suspicion. The first proof of this was to find that orders had been given to cut off my supply of fish. Queen Fuyu was afraid that so long as I was permitted to have all the solid food I wanted, I would not grow thin enough to be content with their diet, and therefore not satisfied to make my home among them for the rest of my life. The next thing to happen to me was to find my supply of oysters and mussels reduced one half by orders of Fuyu. This meant yield or starve. It struck me like a bolt out of the clear. But it has always been just such blows as this which have, throughout my life, aroused me to calm, quick, intelligent action. I hesitated no longer. My plan reached perfection in a single moment. When nightfall came, I hastily scrawled a few lines addressed to my sailing master, telling him of the fate which threatened to overtake me, and bidding him arm a few trusty men and hasten to my rescue. This I tied to the collar of my loved and faithful Bulger. He covered my hand with caresses, and I held him clasped in my arms for an instant, while the tears fell hot and fast. Then I softly opened the door of my bamboo lodge. The night was bright and glorious. "Away, my beloved Bulger," I whispered, stooped and pressing my lips for the last time on his silken ears and shapely head. "To the ship, away!" He paused, looked into my face, gave a low whine as if to say, "Aye, aye, little master, I understand." And away he sprung like the wind. For an instant I could follow him as with a long and sturdy bound he sped along, and then he was gone. The next morning, to my utter astonishment, I was informed that all the preparations for the marriage of the Princess Pufa and the little man Thickalthrough were completed, and that the feasting and merrymaking would begin the day following. This piece of news, startling as it was, I received with perfect calmness. I completely disarmed all suspicion by my apparent satisfaction with the bright prospect of becoming the son-in-law of the great Chief Zwitschwitch. I searched my pockets for trinkets to bestow upon the light and airy Pufa. Queen Fuyu was not visible. So great had been the joy of her mother's heart that, in a moment of weakness, she had partaken too greedily of the rich but unwholesome east wind, and was now suffering from a fearful attack of dyspepsia. This was a most fortunate thing for me, for I am quite certain that Queen Fuyu would never have consented to allow me to return to my own apartment that night. There was now but one thing left for me to do, and that was to make for the distant seacoast, where I had left my ship and crew. and start to that very night. As luck would have it, Chief Zwishwish, noticing that a delightfully strong west wind had begun to blow, insisted upon having a sort of preliminary feast about sundown. I was invited to join the party. Not daring to refuse, I set out with the merrymakers and not only tired myself out by making frantic efforts to fill myself with their invisible food, but it was nearly midnight before the village grew perfectly quiet and everybody seemed to have closed the doors and windows of his dwelling. But after all, the rioting of the wind eaters was a fortunate thing for me. They went to bed so gorged with many and deep draughts of the hearty and filling west wind that they slept like logs, if you will allow me to compare puffballs to solid wood. I waited until the rumbling of the voices had died away as the last group of roisterers broke up and the solitary wind eaters, scattered along the streets, disappeared one by one into their bamboo dwellings. And we're going to pause here and we'll continue with this story in the next video. Please like, subscribe, leave a comment below. Thanks so much for watching. I love you guys. As Tigger says, ta-ta for now.